But one of the things I wanted to ask you first was, how has your perspective changed from like being part of the organization at the air quotes bottom and
Sure.
viewing leadership, that perspective on leadership, then being sales, which in some organizations is sort of like a rogue agent that just does their own thing, but under the guise of leadership, and
Yeah.
then being at the top, and then being able to have that leadership. Like, how have your perspectives changed on that? Um, yeah, and how does that sort of drive your decision making and overall leadership
Yeah.
decision?
Great question. Great question. It's hard because each one is individual to the other, right? In tech support, you're there just to fulfill your tasks. Your bucket fills up with tasks every day, and you're there to empty that bucket and get it down to zero as fast as you can and as well as you can and keep it professional. So in tech support, you're just aiming to do that day in, day out. Sales side is kind of you're right, it's kind of a loose cannon because no one really knows how efficient a salesperson should be, or should a salesperson be closing this dollar amount or this dollar amount, unless you've actually been there and been in the trenches. You can kind of guesstimate whether someone's doing a good job or not. So sales was great because you got a chance to interact with the customers, but also you do have management requirements. You do have quotas you need to hit. You're trying to, and on your side, you're trying to earn commissions and things like that. So my viewpoint on that point was stay professional, make the customer feel warm and fuzzy through the whole process. Wipe Drive, White Canyon, we're not a big brand. So the first issue you have is legitimacy. And so my strategy was to prove legitimacy through our certifications, through our current client list. We have 23 of the Fortune 50, 44 of the Fortune 100 use Wipe Drive, okay? Those are big numbers. For a small player or Fortune 500 or 450 account, if they hear that a Fortune 50 is using us, in their mind, it's a kind of a checkbox, like, okay, well, they can do what they need to do for that client. They'll be able to probably do it for us as well.
Can I ask you
So
a quick question on
legitimacy,
that? Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt.
yeah.
You sort of mentioned like, hey, my number one priority was this, which was improve the legitimacy. Was that the organizational's priority, or did you basically decide that either as a sales function or a sales person?
Great question. I think it was just as a sales function. That's, in your sales process, you're working with clients, that was the weakness that would come up over and over again with the leads I was talking to was, well, who are you guys? You guys are in Utah. Oh, do you outsource all your development to Pakistan? Are you guys just a one-man shop with a little, fly-by-night company? We're going to pay you $20,000 and all of a sudden we never hear from you again. Is your compatibility terrible with hardware? That came up over and over again. And I think, that's a reflection of your website, your literature, your certifications. It was all these things that had to improve so that just by looking at our website or talking with us, they felt safe and comfortable from the get-go. And we're in one of those niches of data erasure where it's been around for 30 years, 40 years. I mean, data erasure is nothing new, nothing special. So for us, there's no real brands in it either. So for the IT guys, there's kind of like it's not really a known product, but how can we trust it? And that's what I was doing on my side. That's what I recognized. And I think the management supported us on that. They helped us get certifications and things like that once we pointed out the weaknesses, and that helped the traction go. But I think it was from my viewpoint, that was the weakness I saw.
But I think one of the, if we tie it back to strategy and what I see, and again, for all of our listeners, is the important, and I assert that through that process, Paul, it was sort of not a turning point because I'm sure it was iterative, but it made a big difference as you were able to build that legitimacy. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. I remember when we got Common Criteria Certification EAL4 Plus, which is for a whole bunch of countries, like 27 countries. And EAL4 Plus was the highest of any data erasure product out there. And once we got that, the selling process was so fast. I mean, we went from having to prove ourselves, argue that we are good, to people just calling up and buying for the next 2 years, 3 years. You know what I mean? It was great. To me, it was just like, it was one of those learning moments. Like once you get that legitimacy, all of a sudden IT managers or the decision makers are just ready to purchase you. That's one of the biggest issues they have, is buying an unknown product, which is fair.
Yeah, but I just want to highlight the fact that it sounds like what I hear that you did really well is as a function, you brought up that concern weakness, what you hear from the customer, brought it to the leadership, got their buy-in, and really looked at like, hey, from a prioritization standpoint, we could just keep hammering the phone,
Yeah, yeah,
but really we're like, okay, let's take a step back, let's assess like what is really getting in the way of us being successful. Let's address that and like dig deep, like let's go boom, 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 a
yeah,
bunch of layers. And then that opened up a whole bunch of doors. So instead of just being operational, you were strategic.
yeah. Well, it's rough because the cost for that certification was $250,000. And so management had to take a gamble and say, okay, let's spend $250,000. Luckily, it doubled our revenue at the time, but it's still management's decision to say, okay, is this going to give that result? Is it? And you have the sales team behind there saying, hey, I think it will, we need to do this, let's do this. And it worked out. And
How
I
long
can't
did the
say it will all the
convincing
time.
take?
Oh, at least 2 years, at
Okay.
least 2 years. And the certification took another year. So it was a good 3 years of still having to argue legitimacy with our clients until that certification was done. So yeah, it's not a quick process.
But worthwhile. And I think that's one of the things that sometimes you could be short-sighted and say $250,000, like, oh, let's see if we can work around it. And I don't know if that's the case with your organization, but I know me being an entrepreneur, I'm fairly cost conscious. Like, that's my nice way of saying I'm cheap sometimes. And saying, hey, like, do we really need to make this investment? But then sometimes, the only way to get to that next level is
Yes.
by, you got to pay to play kind of thing.
You do. And you look at your competitors in the field, you see what certifications they have, because your clients are going to argue what your competitors have against you.
Mhm.
And so when you hear that a bunch, I think management can hear that and say, hey, you know what? Our competitor has EAL 2 plus, and that keeps coming up in arguments. Okay, let's look at getting a certification ourselves. So I think you are driven by the market, by your competitors, and by what your leads tell you. And that helps you to kind of choose what you need to attack and how you need to attack it if you need to.